Hello, everyone, and greetings, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. We thank you for joining us today. My name is Jay Moreau, and I'm the CEO of the U.S. Aggregate and Construction Materials for LafargeHolcim. I'm incredibly excited to host today's meeting, a roundtable around leading a sustainable built environment. Two things that I'm incredibly passionate about: leadership and sustainability. So we have a great panel scheduled today. And, the whole concept of decarbonizing the built environment is incredibly important. So I look forward to the discussion today. Before we start, I want to remind you that the session is being recorded. Be reminded of that. We'll also have a question and answer session that Ann Kelly will moderate. So if you do have questions at the bottom of the screen, you can enter those and we will get to as many of them as we can. And we'll make an effort to do that. And most of all, thank you for joining us today. This is a very important panel, a very important discussion for us. This is a transformative time in our world. There is a transformation afoot. 2 billion people in the next 25 years will move to cities. And 60% of the infrastructure that's required to support those people have yet to be built. So we as leaders, we have an opportunity, and I should rather say we have an obligation to lead the change to decarbonize the footprint in this 60% of infrastructure that has yet to be built. So I think as we talk about it today, it's a great example of how excited I am to be a member of LafargeHolcim. We came out with our net zero target for 2050. But I think what's more exciting from my perspective is that there's an interim goal of 2030. We want to reduce our cement carbon content by 20% by 2030. That's a huge move, and we're leading in that space, and I'm very excited to be part of that team. I talk often to my team about what our objective is, and I make a commitment to my team. Each day, I will lead operation. And I think it's really important for us as leaders to think about how that relates to what we need to do to drive change in the built environment and decarbonizing the built environment. If you give me a minute, let me share with you, I think, a good analogy from sports, because I like to do that all the time. And so I had the opportunity at a recent National Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association to listen to Michael Ghg, who was the captain of the 1984 Miracle on Ice hockey team. And when I listened to him, what struck me is they set out with a goal, a huge goal. They wanted to win the Olympics, but that wasn't their goal. Winning a gold medal wasn't their goal. Winning hockey games wasn't their goal. Winning quarters wasn't their goal. Winning shifts wasn't their goal. They set out to win every face-off. If they won every face-off, then they won the shift. If they won the shift, they won the period. They win multiple periods, they win the game. And before you know it, they win the gold medal. What an amazing story. What a great example of how we as leaders in this industry can make those small changes that have huge impact down the road. I tell my team all the time, and they get tired of hearing it, but we need to take ground every day. And when you do that, and when you make those small decisions and make those small moves and take ground every day, you look back in 2030 and you say, look, we really accomplished something. We look back from 2050 and say, look, we are now net zero carbon in our footprint. So it's an exciting time for us. And I did mention our commitment to net zero, but there are other things that I'm excited about with our LafargeHolcim movements. We released EcoPact earlier this year. It's a low carbon concrete. It's hit the ground running. We're incredibly excited of how it's taken off. But the future is bright for those type of moves. It's a 30 to 100% reduction in carbon in our concrete. But the marketplace is changing, and we want to be on the front end of that and make sure that we're a part of that change. And I think it'll come out in the panel discussion today on how we can take those small steps to make sure that we're part of that change going forward. And EcoPact is one thing. We set a goal. We've recycled about 48 million tons of alternative fuels into our cement plants. By 2031, we want that to be 100 million. So there are small steps, and they sound like big goals, but they really aren't. We just need to move and take ground every day. So as I think about it, I think that we have the opportunity to make the change now that'll lead to big change in the future. So with that as our backdrop, I'd like to hand it off to Ann Kelly. And thank you, Ann, for joining us today to be our moderator for this panel discussion. Ann is the Vice President of Government Affairs for Ceres. And let me go ahead and hand it over to you, Ann, and let you run with it.
Terrific, Jay. Thank you so much for that introduction, and congratulations on Lafarge's goals. Really impressive, both your 2030 and your 2050 goal. Fantastic to celebrate with you today. Not all the news is good in this environment right now in the world, but I can't think of a better place to be during Climate Week than in this discussion as we talk about transformative change in the built environment. And I'm going to keep what you said in mind, Jay, taking ground every day. What does that actually mean? The metaphors abound, breaking new ground. Lafarge is all about building ground. We will talk about that. And in order to have a robust discussion about building a sustainable environment in this area, you really need to talk to the engineering community, to the architectural community, to transportation experts, and of course, to lawmakers, understanding that law can be a lagging indicator, which is how it should work in a democracy. And fortunately, we have representatives from all four groups on today's panel. And we also have all of you, and I'm delighted to welcome all 500 of our listeners today. And you all span the range of expertise from the building environment to the investor community, to the business community, to civil society. So we want to hear from you as well. We'd love to hear your insights, your questions. Please put your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll do everything we can to make sure we answer them in our discussion. So I'm going to now just take a moment and introduce each of our panelists, and then we'll go back to them so that they can talk a little bit about their role in this exciting transformative process. First off, we have Erin McLaughlin. She's Vice President of Private Market Resources at the American Council of Engineering Companies. We also have the Honorable Robert Carroll. He's a member of the New York State Assembly. We have Claire Mifflin. She's the founder of the Center for Zero Waste Design and co-chair of the American Institute of Architects New York Committee on the Environment. And finally, we'll have Michael King. He's Assistant Director of Electrification and Energy at the Colorado Department of Transportation. Welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to have a robust conversation this morning. And of course, at the end, we'll also pull Jay back in for our round of questions. So Erin, why don't you kick it off for us today? I think that you have a few slides to show us. And again, I'll just remind our audience, when you hear a quote that you like, a tweetable tweet, by all means, live tweet, share it, take note. And again, please do offer your questions into the Q&A box. Erin, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay and Ann, for inviting me and the engineering community to speak on this dynamic panel. I won't take up too much time advertising what ACEC is. Basically, we're the trade association for the nation's engineering industry on Capitol Hill. We have 52 state and regional organizations for covering all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and for some reason, Pennsylvania has an extra chapter as well. So, and we represent really the entire architecture and engineering community. Those includes engineers, surveyors, architects, and other specialists in the US. And the next slide is just a little bit about me. I joined ACEC in 2017, but I joined from working within the engineering architecture community, including for ENR top 50 firms, Dewberry and HOK. And I'm an urban planner by education. And at ACEC, I tried to elevate our conversation beyond transportation to include the vertical markets as well. So as you'll see on the next slide, often I spend time sort of reminding folks that really our built environment, which is about $1.3 trillion in annual construction in the US, is made up of a lot of pieces and parts. So that includes the residential market, the private sector market, and public projects as well. And on the next and final slide, you know, I really think this goes to what Jay mentioned. You know, we have so much opportunity, both in the transportation market and in the vertical markets, to really push towards those goals for net zero and carbon neutral design and building. So I often show this slide just to remind everybody and set the table that transportation is a huge sector at 20%, but the opportunities are everywhere, and this is non-residential, including education at 12%, office at 10%, and lots of other sectors as well. So thank you for including me. I think you're on mute, Anne.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, Erin. And we're going to have a lot of questions for you. You know, the scope and scale of what we're talking about really struck me when I heard LafargeHolcim's announcement earlier that concrete is the second most used material in the world after water. That's significant. I'm not sure all of our listeners realize what we are grappling with here. So as you say, you know, the opportunity for transformation is profound. It's absolutely profound. And it's really in your hands, representing the engineering community along with all of your colleagues. So that's exciting. And I look forward to digging into a little bit of the details with you in terms of what engineers are calling for and what's possible. So next, I'd like to call on Assemblyman Carroll. And Assemblyman Carroll, you know, I said earlier, the law is sometimes a lagging indicator of change, but you're leading in this space. And I'm so excited to have our listeners hear about the bill that you've brought in the state of New York and what you think its implications could be. Welcome to you.
Thank you, Anne, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone on the panel and listening to us live. So the bill that you have referenced is the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, which is a bill that came out of a piece of landmark legislation that New York State passed in 2019, which was the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And that bill, what that did was it set posts for New York to meet by 2040 and then 2050. So to reduce all electric emissions by 100% by 2040 from 1990 levels, and to reduce carbon emissions generally throughout the state by 85% by 2050. And after talking to some advocates and helping draft that bill, we realized we would never reach those 2050 goals of reducing carbon emissions by 85% if we didn't reduce the carbon that is embodied in concrete and the built environment, because it is the second most used substance in the world when we're talking about building. And so what this bill does, New York State buys a lot of concrete. It says when we go through the procurement process, we're not just going to look at the costs of concrete. We're going to look at global warming potential. We're going to look at what that costs us environmentally, and we're going to factor that in when we award contracts to major state contracts.
Okay, let's tease that out just a little bit for our listeners, because I think a lot of us are familiar with lowest bid contracts and needs of state governments to go with the lowest bid. And what you said is really important, because your law builds in flexibility to pay a little more in the short term for a product that is actually going to have long-term consequences that will reduce costs over time. You know, if you look at the life cycle of the product, or the true cost, and we're all familiar with the firm true costs, it's very clear that what's actually taking place is by spending a little more in the short term, there's a tremendous cost savings for the state of New York over time. Do you feel as though that equation is starting to be absorbed by your fellow representatives and lawmakers at the state level? Or is that a process? In other words, are people kind of stuck in thinking about the short-term costs without fully appreciating the long-term bargain that is associated with your bill?
Well, look, it's a wonderful question, Anne, and I think all of these, when you're talking about a state as large as New York and other large states, the numbers get humongous very quickly, and lots of these things can seem insurmountable when you're talking about them and the scope that they are. And so what this bill does is I think it brings it down to something that is tangible and tactile. We're saying, look, we're going to give you a 5% discount based on your GWP score. We're also going to give you up to a 3% discount if you do some carbon capture utilization in your production of cement or concrete. And so you could get as much as an 8% discount or an 8% bonus to make yourself more competitive against maybe a cheaper, more dirty concrete producer. And I think that's something that members of the legislature, the governor's office can understand, because every person in the legislature is a generalist, right? This is not our expertise. So you guys are experts in engineering and concrete. We represent the folks in our district. And I really do think, I don't think I'm being Pollyannish when I say that members of the state legislature, members of our federal legislature, I think they understand that this is a huge problem. I think they just don't understand how to fix it. You know, they hear these giant numbers and it seems insurmountable. Bills like this, I think, bring it down to a digestible chunk that says, hey, this is one way we can move in the right direction towards concrete. And there are other bills out there and other good ideas in many other spaces. And that's what I think we're trying to do. And I think that's how real change happens, is smart incremental policies that incentivize private actors to make good choices.
Well put. I think you just gave us our first tweetable quote there. Thank you so much, Assemblyman Carroll. Very well put. We don't want to go for the cheaper and the dirty. Let's incentivize the right choices. Thank you so much. And I should have said at the beginning, congratulations on New York's stunning goals. Okay, Claire Mifflin, let's turn it over to you and hear about innovations in the architectural community. Welcome to you. And I know that you have some slides today as well.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you everyone for inviting me on the panel. Yeah, I'd like to just give you a broad overview of what architects' role is in this sphere. So the AIA Committee on the Environment have championed this framework for design excellence, which is 10 interrelated categories, giving a broad view of sustainability. I could argue all of them relate to decarbonization, but some are far more directly related than others. So in these first 5 categories, I want to stress design for economy on the right-hand side. And that says space is a resource that should be used wisely, just like other resources, energy or water. Next. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in this broad framework, oh, sorry, can you go back to the second framework slide? Yeah, here we have design for resources and design for resources and design for energy that both mention decarbonization, using less energy in our buildings, aiming for net zero carbon operating energy, but also looking at the embodied energy that makes up materials in the building. Next. So this chart actually comes out of the zero carbon infrastructure guidelines from the UK, but it relates to architecture too. And I think the most important thing to look at here is to know that the biggest impact is in the earliest stages. The easiest way to reduce carbon is to build nothing, of course. I heard from a sustainability consultant that was hired to figure out a zero carbon strategy for a prestigious university. He's told them the easiest way would be not to build the new building at all if they just held lectures on Fridays and before 11 a.m. in the buildings they already had. I mean, sure, there's disincentives for the architectural community here, but for the client, we have to see that if we do the early moves, which may be building less, being space efficient, then we can spend more of that money on the high performing materials with low embodied energy. So it's a trade-off, and we have to realize that those early stages offer a lot of opportunity for reducing carbon. Next. So through the AIA in New York, we led the zero waste design guidelines, and they really answer the question, what can architects do to help cities reach zero waste and circular economy? So as architects, how do we design for circularity of materials? Because if we really want to decarbonize, we're going to have to make sure that they're renewable biological material loops and that regenerate rather than destroy ecosystems, and then circular technical material loops that ensure our finite mineral resources don't end up in landfills. Next. So yeah, it gives best practice strategies that are very similar to the framework. How can you optimize materials, select materials that are healthy and can be reused and have recycled and low global warming potential? And then looking at what phases of design you have to do these things. And of course, you have to start early. Next. So looking at concrete in particular, what can architects do? I've pulled some strategies from the 2030 Carbon Smart Materials Palette. This is a great resource, a project of architecture 2030, and looks at all common building materials and how can you make them more, less carbon intensive. So after program and space reductions, looking to see if you can reuse existing structures on site is important. Recently, I saw a project that did a full life cycle analysis to look at what would be the impact of reusing the foundations versus a whole new building. And these are complicated evaluations, but software is getting better to look at them. You know, what size structural, grid, floor to floor heights, what type of slabs, all of these have really big implications on the carbon. And then you also have to make sure that whatever you design has a long future life. Here, this project shows a project as part of re-envisioning Paris that looks at reuse and adaptability. They took an existing building and then they added this new concrete structure, and they made sure that the new building has good floor-to-floor heights that will allow it to be adaptable in the future, and beautiful use of concrete in these arches that allow the interior space to connect to the outside space. So as architects, we have to realize as well, if we don't design something that's beautiful and adaptable for future use, it's not going to have a long life, and that's not going to help our decarbonization. And lastly, next, the specifications. Assemblyman Carroll showed how important these are to help specify concrete that has low global warming potential. And as architects, we have to work closely with engineers to make sure our specifications ensure for a long life of the structure and the lowest possible carbon impact. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Claire. And I'm tempted to press you on the middle slide that talked about building nothing, kind of the Zen approach. But I'm going to guess that that's not particularly popular in the building community. What you may be getting at there is looking for opportunities to restore, and as you said, to build less and to build efficiently. Can you comment overall on the uptake of your model, on the interest among architects for environmentally sound materials? Thank you for mentioning the need to preserve beauty. I'm going to guess that LafargeHolcim's products don't sacrifice beauty in any way. But can you just talk about the overall, where's the architectural community at this point in terms of their eagerness to try to incorporate more sustainable materials in buildings?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think architects love a good challenge and to solve something that is a thorny, difficult problem. They love to do while keeping the beauty as well. I would say there has been such focus on operating energy for many years that now architects are beginning to turn their focus on embodied carbon, which is a much trickier problem. And we really need to think in a system way for that. So I would say architects are starting to grapple with it. It's early days and it's such a complicated thing that people tend to jump to quick decisions like, let's build everything with timber, which may be good, may be bad. It all depends on how the forests are managed. So generally architects are looking at, when I've made the decision for what material I'm using, let me do the best I can. And that's the easiest way as architects to go forward.
Okay. Well, lots to unpack there. Thank you so much, Claire. And let me just remind our audience again to feel free. I'm seeing some questions come into our Q&A chat. Please feel free to continue to add them as you have questions, observations, and we're going to take those up. Okay, important to talk about transportation, and over to you, Michael King. Let me start by congratulating you on the state of Colorado's really stunning global warming goals, and we look forward to hearing from you. And I think that you have some slides to share as well. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne, and to the whole team at Lafarge. Yeah, so I'm going to just speak briefly about GHG reduction in transportation. Transportation is, of course, as a state DOT, it's an interesting confluence of the built environment, individual consumer choice in terms of the vehicles and the modes that are chosen by the users, as well as owning and operating a lot of facilities such as rest areas and buildings. So we have an opportunity, but also a challenge that we straddle multiple of these fields in terms of GHG reduction. I'm going to start talking a little bit about materials. So Portland limestone cement, the first use in the United States was in Colorado back in 2007. It has been more widely adopted since then. And in fact, European countries were using it prior to that since the 1960s. Portland limestone cement, one of the benefits, you can reduce the carbon emissions per ton of cement by up to 10%. It allows you to reuse waste products in the production of that cement. And CDOT's specs allow up to 50% substitution of fly ash with a minimum required 20%. And so we have found over the years that that is a good level for us, and that it produces the same functionality as traditional cement products. Some notable uses in Colorado, whether or not you're familiar with these projects, I can assure you that they were high profile projects. 7 miles of paving on US 287 near Lamar, which is a major freight corridor. The express lanes between Boulder and Denver on US 36, which was a very high profile project that was completed several years ago, as well as 18 miles of C470 around Denver. So really some successful projects in the past. If you move to the next slide, please. So one of the benefits of CDOT leading in this area is that our experience has been able to work with the contractors in the state and with other municipalities to follow our lead. I think that as a state DOT, there's a lot of credibility that we can lend to these new approaches. So other municipalities have started to adopt similar specs to what CDOT has used for green construction materials. But it's important to note, and I think some of the other panelists have already referenced, that the cultural element can be just as important as the technical element. Getting folks that have traditionally relied on tried and true methods to incorporate new approaches, to think about carbon as part of their job when traditionally it has not been part of their job. So that is a continuing process, and even within the department, we have recently been doing sort of a top to bottom assessment of every part of our operations and how we might adjust it to consider GHG reduction as part of that, whether that be materials, whether that be the power that we use in our facilities, and of course the roadway and the vehicles themselves, which if we go to the next slide, we will talk a little bit about that. So to put this in the context of the broader statewide effort, as Anne referenced, the state of Colorado has greenhouse gas reduction targets, 26% by 2025, 50% by 2030, and 90% by 2050. Those are across the entire economy, not just transportation, but transportation is the largest portion of that pie at this point in Colorado. There's currently a greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap that is nearing completion in the state of Colorado, which essentially is an assessment of the pathways necessary to achieve these targets by the dates. And of course, it should go without saying that we've already been bumped a little bit off course by COVID. And so we've had to start integrating what are the impacts of the COVID pandemic on these targets in the shorter and longer term. So that will be coming out by the end of the month. And I think many folks on this call might be interested in seeing that. So you can see some of the things that document will do: establishing the 2005 baseline, considering the effects of the 14 bills that were passed by the General Assembly in 2019, and then finding what are the most cost-effective and efficient pathways for us to achieve those targets in the future years. Next slide, please. one of the major areas of opportunity is, of course, vehicle electrification. I know that that is not the main focus of this discussion, but I think it's important to note that we see this as one of our biggest leverage points as a DOT. We have a goal of 940,000 EVs on the road in Colorado by 2030. Today, we have about 30,000, so there's work to do there. We're also working on a clean trucking strategy, working with the trucking industry, the manufacturers, and communities to identify ways to reduce emissions from those trucks and the trucking facilities, which are, of course, often based in disproportionately impacted communities and have air quality and human health effects that we want to avoid. We're also looking to convert our transit vehicles in the state of Colorado. They are a smaller number, but they are obviously larger vehicles. They run quite a lot, and they also offer folks that do not have access or do not want to use automobiles the opportunity to benefit from the electrification process. Finally, we're also looking at hydrogen as a fuel. What are the possibilities in Colorado? As well as how do we work to ensure that equity in transportation electrification so that we're not creating a new system which is green but still inequitable while we replace our older transportation system. Next slide, please. So this last slide is just to show you one of the major areas is the build out of charging infrastructure in the state of Colorado. Even if you're not familiar with the geography of our state, you can see that between the green existing DC fast charging locations and the red that are grant funded and under construction or under development, we are starting to build that statewide network because we know that many people, when they choose a vehicle to purchase, lease, or use, they're not just thinking about their daily commute, they're thinking about their trip to the mountains, their trip to the state parks and national parks. So we need to be able to serve that need to convince people that these vehicles can work for their lifestyle. We're working directly with our Scenic Byways Commission to electrify the scenic byways for tourism and rural economic development. We're working with our state parks to put charging in as many parks as possible so people can plug in, do a 3-hour hike, and then drive home with a full charge. And of course, we're building at the major towns and communities across the state so that it's not just a Denver Boulder thing to be able to have an EV. We want this to be accessible to everyone. And I believe that concludes my slides. These are just some photos of 2 of our CDOT electric vehicles. On the left, that's a battery electric, and on the right, it's a plug-in hybrid electric. So we're also trying to walk the walk. And the assembly member mentioned the difficulty of procuring things that might cost more on the front end. And that's another example where in Colorado, we had to adjust our statutes to allow us to pay a little bit more for electric vehicles in order to save money in the long run, adjusting state processes that are designed for sort of an older paradigm and trying to update those so that they allow us to make the right choice, the cost-effective choice for the taxpayer without running afoul of current statutes. So thank you very much. I'm interested to hear the rest of the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. Wow, that's action-packed slide deck, and congratulations on Colorado's leadership in so many areas. Thank you for highlighting the necessary cultural change that has to take place and how much engineers tend to think about functionality. I'm gonna tap Aaron to build on that question and where engineers are moving. But let me ask you first. Colorado, if I understand correctly, is one of LafargeHolcim's biggest customers in terms of their product. And I'm just would wonder if you could advise us as to how Colorado has been so amenable to making these kinds of environmentally sound purchases. Obviously, the tone, the adaptability of Colorado is reflected in what you just said as well in purchasing electric vehicles, understanding that you pay a little bit more in the short term and you gain a tremendous amount in the long term. I'm wondering how you think the state has become so amenable to these long-term changes. Is it your governor? Is it a part of your goals? And how would you advise other states who may be listening to today's conversation?
You know, I think it's a combination of many things. We have had great leadership from multiple governors over the years of both political parties that have prioritized this and understood that it should not necessarily be a political issue to address climate change. Obviously, the culture in Colorado is very focused on the outdoors, and people notice when the impacts of climate change on snowpack and on temperatures. Several weeks ago, you may have heard we had a 100-degree day, and 48 hours later there was snow. People in Colorado notice these things, and we understand that this is a problem that we can solve together. I would also say that, as Claire mentioned, architects love to solve a problem. Engineers love to solve a problem too. I'm not an engineer, but I work with a lot of them, and I can tell you that they always like a challenge, but they also want to prioritize the safety of the roadway network. They want to make sure that the structures and the functionality is there first. So working with them to understand their options, but also giving them that confidence that what they're doing will be supported by leadership, that this is a priority, writing that into our departmental goals, that this is a part of our work, is to consider climate change and adapt to climate change, when traditionally DOTs have not thought that way. So it is a gradual process. It takes many people over many years. And I think that the results are what really, when you have good results and they're consistent over the years, people gain confidence and it becomes the new normal.
Well, thanks so much, Michael. Lots of tweetable quotes in what you said, perhaps most importantly, that climate change and climate action are not partisan. You heard it here. Over to you, Aaron. What do you think about the engineering community in adapting and moving in this cultural change that Michael is citing?
Well, I think that the engineers are very excited to help solve this problem, and both New York and Colorado are clear leaders. So the federal government has often not stepped up in recent years, and so we're looking at states and localities, and it's in different parts of the country we're seeing that great leadership, which is very interesting. I think a couple points based on what others have noted is that when we look at bringing a project to being carbon neutral and to net zero design, historically we've really looked at energy, and Claire referenced that, and how energy plays into it. And so thinking about how materials and how Lafarge and others are introducing, materials that can play into that as we look at sort of the holistic design of infrastructure is really, really important because, strangely enough, in this moment with the pandemic, we may see an increased energy load in many of our buildings and in much of our infrastructure with regards to airflow and sort of other considerations. So the fact that we can look at things in a holistic way and look at materials to help balance, some needs that we may need in the short term, which haven't necessarily revealed themselves, I think is really important.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. And I'm thrilled to say that our audience is fully engaged and they're sending in many questions, and we're going to pursue some of those. And let me just remind our audience that today's session is being recorded. So if you can't write everything down, you are going to receive a recording afterwards, and continue to please put these questions forward. So much to cover here. Assemblyman Carroll, I'm going to start with you with some of these questions that have come in. If New York State were to adopt your legislation, it's clearly a game changer for the state. But considering the procurement power of New York, do you believe it will be transformational for the entire Northeast region and potentially the US writ large?
Well, I think the purchasing power of the state of New York, of course, will then move private actors in other states in and around the Northeast. And so the hope is, right, and that's why this is such a great piece of public policy, is by just changing what the state of New York will buy, you possibly change what half a dozen or 10 other states will buy, and also private actors, because I'm no expert in, kind of how one produces cement or concrete, but from what I've been told when I talk to experts is that when someone creates that mix, they're unlikely to start changing it for each and every client. And so if they create a mix for New York that will work in private industry or for other states, suddenly more and more people are going to look to adopt that mix. And having one large actor make a big change, obviously it makes it easier for others to follow suit. So I hope by getting New York to make this change, we'll get others to join us.
Absolutely. Well, let's press on that a little bit. And one question that's come in, I wonder, I'm sure you've thought of this, will the legislation result in smaller companies not being able to compete for state contracts if they're lacking the resources to produce the same kind of carbon-friendly concrete? This is one of those classic market questions that I know you've thought through.
So yeah, I mean, that's always the fear, right? That whenever government creates new regulation, it is large actors who are able to adapt, and small actors are wiped out because they don't have the resources to compete or to change. Baked in the bill, we actually have a tax credit for ready-mix concrete producers and aggregate producers that allows them to get the technology to find their GWP score, their global warming potential score. And so that's one of the ways that we build into the bill a way for smaller producers to take part in this bill and in reducing their carbon footprint and the global warming potential of their product.
I see. So it sounds like you thought about that and you're aiming to be as inclusive as possible.
And look, I think, right, and the folks at Lafarge would be able to speak to this better than I, but, you know, the ready-mix concrete industry, of course, is dotted throughout the nation, and there are tons of small producers and tons of projects that, because you need proximity to those mixing plants when you're building those projects, if you don't bring those folks into the fold and you don't bring them along, you know, all we're going to be talking about is maybe reducing the global warming potential of, you know, cement production. But if we don't look at the concrete production as well, we're going to be missing part of, you know, part of the sauce, part of the way that we reach these goals. And so I think the small ready-mix concrete producer and making sure that he or she is a part of this and able to participate is essential in making sure that the built environment does decarbonize, because it's those people who are going to build out so many of our buildings, and it's those folks who are, you know, integral in making sure that we reach our goals. And if we only kind of see this issue at 36,000 feet, you know, I don't think we're going to get there.
Thank you, Assemblyman Carroll. What do you think about that, Jay? I know you've given this a lot of thought, and what you're doing is really, you're not doing this just for Lafarge. You're really looking to transform the industry, and I know there are many players of many sizes. Your thoughts on the question that I posed to Assemblyman Carroll?
Sure, and Assemblyman Carroll's leadership is dead on. What we want to see is our customers demanding low carbon products, and we want to produce those. We want to produce those cements and make them available to the small customer, because they're our customer, and the more that we can get the momentum behind that demand, and our customer coming to us and saying, we need a solution because we want to be competitive. And the more that we can get momentum behind New York, behind these recommendations, then the more we can be a part of leading that change, and then others will follow. So I think it's a great opportunity for a customer to demand that we supply what they need.
Well, thank you for highlighting demand. And I certainly, that's a huge topic here. I would invite more questions about how we create that demand, shape that demand, what that looks like, and how we scale it. There's another question for you, Jay, that I think is somewhat fundamental for LafargeHolcim. How are you planning to communicate? First up, there's a congratulations on your leadership this week, which I second. And I'm wondering, the listener is wondering, how are you planning to communicate your goals to planners, investors, the construction community, and all of the relevant stakeholders, your overall strategy? What's the plan for really spreading the message?
Well, I think there's two parts to that answer. First, it's forums like this where we can talk about it and share this with the stakeholders that are right here in this panel, because it takes an effort from all those different stakeholders to move the needle. And then we need to tell our story, and we need to be much more aggressive in getting our story out and what our offerings are and what we can actually bring to the table in this space and be a leader. Now, the second part of it that I think about, though, is our investors, our employees, And the next generation of folks that are going to be home buyers, are going to be working in those offices, they're attuned to this and they care about it, and they care about it passionately. So we have to think about that. And when we're going to, our stakeholders are our investors, our stakeholders are our customers. And we want to make sure that we're designing our product and our portfolio to meet their demands. I envision a day when the home buyer wants to know the carbon footprint of that new home they're buying. And I absolutely want to be on the front edge of supplying that to them. We're not there yet, but we can certainly see it coming. I think the swell is there, and we'll see that gain some momentum quite quickly.
Another tweetable, I'm hoping that day is actually coming up next week, if not sooner. I think you're right. And, you know, Jay, embedded in your comments, you said next generation. And I have to say it when I think about the next generation coming up, and I can see Assemblyman Carroll is a very young lawmaker. Congratulations to you. There's just no question about the demand of this next. I would invite any of our panelists to talk about what they're seeing among the younger generation, whether it's younger investors, architects, engineers, members of civil society. There's just no question about the demand creation there. So thank you for that answer. And I also couldn't help but notice, if you look at Jay, your background has this wonderful logo of net zero. And when I was looking at Claire's slides, and she mentioned beauty and she referred to Paris, I guess I'm wondering, how far are we from being able to put a label like what you have behind you on concrete, on products? If we don't label, and I know LEED has dealt with this for years, we've all talked about building labels. I would invite anyone to comment on how far we are from being able to be transparent about the nature of the building materials, whether it's in a highway or a high rise, and putting a label on that that says net zero. You know, is that something that there will ever be demand for? Jay or anyone?
I could jump in there if you'd like.
Great, Claire.
I mean, environmental product declarations are just that. I mean, starting with transparency, getting manufacturers to analyze the environmental implications of their products. They are becoming much more common throughout the industry. For all types of products, they're being required in LEED. You need them for your life cycle analysis. And traditionally, they've been tough to do in products like concrete that are not always uniform. And that's why it was really important that Assemblyman Carroll was saying they're giving help for smaller manufacturers to be able to figure this out. And I'm sure Jay could add to how that relates to concrete, but that is the label you're looking for.
Yes, environmental product declarations. Thank you for that, Claire. Let's see more of them in more forms. A question for you, Aaron. Could you share examples from your engineering background of any members where, in particular, engineers have made the choice to build greener versus building at a lower cost? And that there could be any range of examples, but I think the questioner is looking for some specific examples that perhaps you can offer.
Right. Well, I think we sort of talked about life cycle, and life cycle is something our clients always ask for, life cycle cost that benefits. So just choosing, just in the phase of design or choosing materials, you have to keep an eye out for that. And then, you know, we've seen different policy actions historically that have created lower life cycle costs and more renewable, you know, from more renewable resources. So, you know, right now we're at a moment in time where there's a lot of conversation about the Green New Deal at the federal level and what that might look like. And, you know, we are in a recession. It's a different kind of recession, but it's a recession. And so when we think about strategies that might go into that, looking historically, I looked it up this morning, the cost of solar went down 50% between 2013 and 2018. And really a lot of that came from the Recovery Act, which helped, you know, regardless of how you feel about it, helped, you know, bring us out of the last recession. And so it's very commonplace now to have a solar strategy. And the cost and the applicability across different scales, a size of projects, size of solar companies is much different than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And so when we talk about these new strategies, and some of them aren't that new, and talk about building materials such as the one Lafarge is enabling folks and policymakers to look at, I think that, you know, the ultimate goal is not even for it to be so common that we don't have to label a building or a piece of infrastructure, you know, that it's just very, very common. And, you know, there'll be different opportunities for that. And I think that this year and the next couple of years will present a unique moment in time for us to sort of elevate the conversation around that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you're so right that labeling something almost makes it the exception that proves the rule. And we go back to the early years when people said electric toaster and electric iron, and then everything was electric. And thanks for highlighting the 2009 stimulus. You're absolutely right, and how that boosted the renewable energy sector. And perhaps in this next round, as we get behind the Build Back Better notion, the same will happen for your sector. A question for the whole panel from someone saying, I'm curious what the panel's thoughts are on walkable cities and how cities can focus on new construction being more open to walking, biking, or public transit. Any thoughts from anyone on the panel on that and how environmentally sensitive materials might contribute?
I could speak to that a little bit. Obviously, from the transportation perspective, in the same way that I think Claire referenced the idea that the most carbon-friendly building is the one that you don't build, the most carbon-friendly trip is either the one that you don't take or the one that you take without using any carbon, or by walking, by biking around your community. So while obviously vehicle electrification and the materials that we use and the power that we purchase are all parts of greening the transportation system, there is also the element of land use, designing cities and communities so that you don't need to get in a car or even a bus if you don't want to, and so that you can get around your community. The concept, I believe, in Paris of the 15-minute city has been talked about a lot recently, that everything you need for your daily life should be within 15 minutes of your home. A lot of American cities are not designed that way. So, you know, from a planning standpoint, those decisions come years and years before anyone necessarily moves in, decides what form of transportation they're going to use, what type of engine that transportation is employing. So getting those small decisions right on the front end, as Jay referenced in his opening remarks, can pay huge dividends later on when we have communities that people of all ages and physical abilities and interests and preferences are able to move about freely without needing to invest in expensive infrastructure that creates carbon pollution.
Thank you so much, Michael. Absolutely. Other thoughts? Emily Carroll, go ahead.
Yeah, so first, I agree completely with what Michael just said, and I represent Brooklyn in the state legislature, which of course is a borough of New York City. And so New York, of course, is a wonderful public transportation network that I think is essential when we're talking about making cities more conducive to pedestrians, to bikers. If you don't have a good public transportation system as a backbone, people are going to be incentivized to buy cars. You know, I have a subway stop 3 blocks from my home. I have multiple bus lines because there are times when biking or walking isn't possible. And if you don't have other transportation alternatives, people are going to want to go and purchase cars. Further, I have a tax rebate bill that we have a tax rebate program for electric cars in New York State. This bill that I have would give it for also electric bicycles, because of course, if you're a fit and able-bodied person, riding a bike a few miles to work isn't that bad of a thing. But if you're not, or if there are other impediments, you know, having an electric bike gives you the ability to move about more freely. And one of the things that we've been grappling with in New York City due to COVID-19, of course, is we used to have approximately 6 million people take the subway every day, and another 1 million people take the bus every day just in the 5 boroughs. Those numbers have dropped by 70% due to COVID-19. And there are a lot of folks who are worried to go back on buses and subways. We can't have them in a place this dense all go into private cars. We need them to be able to walk. We need them to be able to bike. And, you know, I think the neighborhoods, at least in New York City, that are most desirable also happen to be those that are most walkable and most bike friendly. They are the places where you can go to a supermarket, a local restaurant, a movie theater, a hardware store, and everything is, as Michael said, you know, kind of 15 minutes from your apartment or home door.
Well, thank you for that, some of them. And Carol and Aaron, I know, to build on that, when you and I spoke earlier, I think you had some projections about the likely construction that's coming, future construction for roads and highways. And I wonder if you can share that with the group. And do you have any sense about, is there any projection for construction of walkways, of walkways or bikeways? Do we know?
Yeah. Well, the transportation sector, and it sort of depends on what Congress will do in the next year or so, reauthorization of a full FAST Act, which is the Transportation Act. But transportation is expected to be secondary to telecom and data centers and broadband, the hottest market in the near term within the next 5 years. So there is lots of opportunity for us to invest in transportation in different ways and in different strategies than we have before. And then, of course, you know, infrastructure encompasses all different sorts of buildings and horizontal and vertical infrastructure. So, but certainly the pandemic has caused people to rethink public transit, which is so key to sustainability and so key to certainly New York and most of the Northeastern communities, that we're still in a moment where we're not sure how this is going to change, but certainly having people be able to sort of live, work, and play within a close environment continues to be really important in how we plan and design communities.
Absolutely. All right, a question from the audience for you, Claire, on what the architectural profession is doing to incorporate sustainable design principles into programs in universities across the country, in design schools. Are these principles that we're talking about today making it into the education for new emerging architectural students?
Yeah, on this, I can only really talk about what's happening in the New York chapter. And I would say there is a lot of work with design schools in New York. I am continually being asked to speak at design schools. The chapter gives students free access to all its panels, and there are so many of them on sustainable design. So I'm aware of those initiatives. I mean, I think design schools are changing a lot. I can't speak on a national level to what is going on, but I know that AIA is making these resources available to everyone, and design schools particularly, and sponsoring competitions and awards for students as well as professionals.
Well, building on that a little bit, you know, one person is asking a question about we have often looked at the built environment, and what we don't want is silos. When everyone says silos, I like to say cylinders of excellence, which is how I look at all of your fields. But let's be honest, a questioner, I think, is asking a question we all need to consider, which is that, you know, construction material is one part of the building value chain that's really important to reduce CO2 emissions. But how can we better integrate all of the stakeholders in a way to really get sustainable construction for all? And now I'm guessing, as I look at Claire and Aaron, engineers and architects have thought about this for a long time, but now we really need a broad stakeholder involvement, you know, all the members on the screen and beyond. Any thoughts from anyone on the panel about that kind of holistic approach to the built environment that would incorporate the interests of the designers, the engineers, the folks making the early products, and lawmakers who need to perhaps revise codes and be on board, and planners? Is there movement in that direction? That's what the person is asking us.
I think there certainly is. I think one example of where this is sort of being tested out is in the net zero districts. So there's in different, some of them are, you know, sponsored by particular cities or states. I believe Colorado has one, and the federal government was trying one here in Southwest DC. Is, you know, when you're sort of tracking carbon, it's much easier to do it by district, you know, where you have you know, a facility that produces energy, different facilities, maybe residential, commercial, industrial, within a certain area. And so I think you know, from the owner, from the asset, whoever owns those assets, to who is living and working there, through sort of the architecture, engineering, and construction community. That's where we're seeing a lot of that play out, is sort of in those net zero districts.
Okay.
I would add on to that. I mean, I think that's really important what Erin said about focusing on the local and the net zero districts. But sometimes there is a kind of disconnect because it's hard to calculate the embodied carbon of materials coming into a district. So often those initiatives really focus on operating energy use and transportation energy use, and maybe the embodied carbon of the buildings themselves, but that's a difficult calculation. So when cities try and get net zero, then they don't use that calculation. They're not calculating scope 3 emissions and emissions that are embodied in their building materials, because that's not within the protocol of how they're accounting for it. So I'd like to just, I think that will change in time, but some multidisciplinary efforts that are great on the material side are things like the Carbon Leadership Forum, who are really getting multiple stakeholders together, from architects, engineers, product manufacturers, to look at what we can do on carbon leadership of materials as well.
Absolutely, and really being able to account for embedded carbon is absolutely where we need to go. So thank you for your comments. A question for you, Jay. I don't want to say it's a concrete question. You must be so tired of jokes about getting concrete. I told myself I wouldn't do that, but this one is pretty concrete. What new supplemental cementitious materials are expected to replace the fly ash in concrete as coal-fired power is phased out? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think it came up earlier that, you know, PLCs are going to be, that PLC concrete is going to be really driving those results. And, you know, what really drives that more than anything, though, is, and it came up from several of the panelists here, is moving to performance mixes from prescriptive mixes. And that's a big movement for the industry. And that's really what we want to see, because that's where we can create value. And we can do that not only in our own concrete business, but then as it goes for all of our customers and all the smaller concrete players that are using our cement. So I think that the ability to use Portland limestone cements, the specifications change, the more we can get a broader acceptance of that. It can be a challenge for the concrete people, because they don't want to keep two different kinds of cements. They really need to keep one. So the more momentum we can get behind that, when we can get the specifications aligned, get all the stakeholders thinking about, we need to use one cement and it needs to be a carbon, low carbon, or as close to carbon neutral as we can get it, then we can get a tremendous amount of momentum behind it. But I think that's really the path to the future.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, to sort of normalize the notion of low carbon cement. Claire, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that one product that there's a lot of interest about here in New York is glass porcelain as a cement replacement. There's been tests with our DOT and some of the big developers to replace cement with glass porcelain. And because we have a lot of glass in New York City from our residential stream that is not getting reused, primarily the brown and green glass, there's no market for it. So if we can look at materials like that are heavy, you don't want them to have to go far, and reuse them locally to reduce the global warming potential of cement, I think that's a great solution. And building product ecosystems have a lot of information about that on their website if anybody wants to know more. I know they just got the ASTM standard approved after many years of effort.
Well, great, Claire. Maybe you can provide a link in the Q&A. That's a fantastic example of using what materials in the waste stream that I know you're an expert in. Okay, question for Assemblyman Carroll and Michael coming about, you know, what states can do. In 2018, Washington State commissioned a pilot program called the Buy Clean Study, tasked with analyzing embodied carbon policy and proposing methods to categorize structural materials. Wouldn't it be prudent for New York to take a similar approach? There are some concerns that bid price discounts could lead potentially to bid manipulation, wondering whether New York or Colorado has ever considered this question. Any thoughts, Assemblyman Carroll?
Sure, and look, I think there are lots of ideas and policies that the state should take. You know, I referenced when I first spoke that in June of 2019, the state passed the Community Leadership Climate Protection Act, which would set up a number of panels about reducing New York's carbon emissions, both in electric generation and then overall carbon emissions for the whole state. New York is unique in that a disproportionate amount of our carbon comes from our buildings, mostly because of the mass transit system in the New York metropolitan area reduces the amount of cars that are on our streets per capita. And New York also happens to have some of the largest electric generation in the nation, mostly because of very old hydroelectric dams built from the 20s to the 60s. And so I kind of say all that to say, I think there are lots of ideas to go and say, how do we get to this end goal? And I do believe, you know, incentivizing the production of low embodied carbon concrete is a smart piece of public policy. It definitely will have certain consequences and outcomes that we may or may not be able to control for. And what it definitely doesn't mean is that there shouldn't be other aspects that we say, look, we're going to just put an across the board mandate to buy clean or to do X or to do Y. And I think that will continue to happen. Right now, the CLCPA is a very top-down program. It was passed by the legislature, but it is the governor's office, along with the legislature, that puts together these panels, which will have broad authority. Some of those panel of experts will do great pieces of public policy, but in other ways they may make mistakes. And I think that's the main goal of the legislature, is to keep running good ideas up the flagpole and trying to get at how do we kind of keep knocking at this problem and figuring out the best solution. So I'm kind of open to many things, but I do think that this one bill is, its simplicity allows it to happen now, which is so important for a big state like New York. Too often, our cures for some of these problems are so complex that they're hard to ever get off the ground.
Absolutely. Thank you. Michael, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just echo everything that the assembly member said, that when faced with these huge challenges as a country and as individual states, we are sometimes tempted to try to develop one giant solution that covers everything. But I agree that the smaller, more targeted efforts that are easier to understand, easier to implement in the short term, make this much more accessible. They also help individual actors in society see their role in adapting to GHG, as opposed to this being something that the federal government has to do or the state government has to do. It highlights for folks, this is my role and this is something that I can achieve. One example in Colorado that I think might be interesting and related to the question is that one of the bills from last year's legislative session in 2019 was that our state Public Utilities Commission now has to consider the social cost of carbon in future utility resource plans. That social cost of carbon is set at $46 currently, and I believe there's a mechanism to increase that over time. But that may be one methodology for starting to think about the life cycle costs of investments beyond just the utility sphere, but potentially in procurements at the state level or in construction projects. Because as we've talked about on several occasions today, the upfront costs of some of these things appear to be higher if you only look up front. But if you look over time, both from a maintenance and operations standpoint, but also from a social cost of carbon, of the impacts of that, by showing that cost up front when you're doing your cost benefit and selecting projects to fund or selecting materials to use, that can help really illustrate what you're actually getting for your money, as opposed to what it looks like on day one versus, you know, year 10 down the line. So that's one example of the way that the state is trying to adapt our thinking to make smarter investments. And I think that that type of approach might be applicable to other fields. I think that our greenhouse gas roadmap will highlight some of the other ways that we could make small incremental changes that will have those big impacts.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you raising the social cost of carbon, and how we can build that into our state government's bidding decisions is of vital importance. Let's stick with cost for a moment. And Jay, maybe this one is for you. Can you talk about the difference in cost to produce the low carbon concrete cement versus traditional cement products, other than the outside of the initial setup costs? How much is there a price differential? How much more expensive is it for you to produce, if it is more expensive?
Well, excuse me, there's always investment involved to have the capability to do it. But, you know, once you have the investment and the fixed cost is there, then, yeah, the cost is comparable. I mean, there's not a significant cost differential here. You know, so we like to see the demand move that direction. And you know, as specifications change and there's more demand for the lower carbon products, then we're prepared to invest to make sure that we can supply those. So we take a long-term view of the business, and the movement in specifications helps us do that.
All right. Well, I can hardly believe this has been so robust that we're nearing the end of our conversation, and I want to put you all through a quick lightning round here. I'm going to give each of our panelists 30 seconds to make a recommendation to all of you listeners about what they would recommend you do for the next 12 months in this space. What's their number one recommendation as to what needs to happen? I'm going to finish with Jay, who is going to wrap us up at the end. I want to thank all of you for your insights, for the work that you do every day in this movement. It's really inspiring. And I want to thank all of you who listened and offered such thoughtful questions. We didn't get to every single one of them, but I would remind you that this session is being recorded. And I know that our friends at LafargeHolcim and our panelists, you know, would be thrilled to follow up as we dig into the kind of transformational change that we are all a part of. So let's circle back, and Erin, I'm going to start with you. 30-second lightning round, your recommendations. Having heard this conversation, what do you think needs to happen in the next 12 months?
Well, I think, I'm not sure it's a recommendation as much as it is a thought point. I'd be very curious to have this community give some thought to the relationship between a carbon tax, what historically has been a gas tax, and how we can sort of fund infrastructure in the future.
Thank you. Okay. Assemblyman Carroll.
Not to give a platitude, but I would, you know, think global, act local. You know, I think it's so important that folks in the business world, in their communities, you know, kind of lead by example and realize that they can self-actualize, and then they are very empowered. And I am very optimistic, and I think there's a lot that our state and federal governments can do. And with the right folks, we can get there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your leadership, Assemblyman Carroll. Claire?
Adding on to what Assemblyman Carroll said there, I was going to suggest that you join a local group, whether that's the Committee on the Environment chapter, if you're an architect, the Carbon Leadership Forum, Drawdown have chapters, and discuss with people locally what's the best things that can be done. Those groups push policy, they educate members, and be part of the local conversation of how change can happen.
Absolutely. It's all about participation. Thank you so much, Claire, for all that you're doing. And Michael?
Yeah, I think I have two versions of the same idea. The one is to talk with somebody, whether a colleague or an acquaintance from an industry or a specialization that you think has nothing to do with your work, and explain it to them and get their feedback, because I find the best ideas come from people that have no preconceived notions about the problem you're trying to solve. And a similar version of that is if you can hire an intern or a young person that is just coming out of school and bring them into your organization. They will ask you questions about why things are done and how things are done that will illustrate to you that they could be done differently and better. So there's nothing like a fresh perspective, and I try to employ that as much as possible.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. I couldn't agree more. Thanks so much to all of you. And Jay, I know you want us to take ground every day, which is what we're all committed to doing. And I know you're going to wrap us up. Thank you for inviting me to share this conversation, and I'll turn it over to you to close.
Very good. Thank you, Anne, for leading the discussion today, and thank you to each of the panelists. This was a great discussion, great ideas. I learned a lot, and I appreciate the open discussion. So, you know, my challenge to everyone is very similar, and that if we're going to be successful in this space, we need to listen, and the best leaders in the world are those that can listen. And I challenge everyone to go have a cup of coffee with somebody that thinks differently than you. Because what you will find is you will find common ground. You'll find some way where you can have a discussion with those people and talk about how we think about this process and how we see the future and how we can do the small things that lead to the great results that we'll have many years down the road. But we have to set on that path today if we're going to get there, and we need momentum. So I challenge you to go have those conversations, and that's how we're going to move the needle, and that's how we'll change the future. Thank you again, everyone. It was been a great pleasure to be your host, and stay safe, stay strong, and we'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.